Hi, Josh Kilroy here with the Fair Deal Democrats podcast. Today I wanted to discuss a fascinating new essay on money in politics that came out in the last couple of days. It was written by Adam Bonica, who has a Substack page on data and democracy. And it talks about the real power of money in our political system. So, first of all, he rejects the sort of most obvious influence of money on politics, namely campaign spending. So, campaigns raise all these millions of dollars at the presidential level. It can be hundreds of millions of dollars, even approaching $1 billion on a presidential campaign, 100 plus million for a Senate race, and 15, 20 million for a heated congressional race. But he goes through, and his thesis is that is not the real culprit of how money distorts our democracy. We tend to imagine, and that's a direct quote, we tend to imagine corruption as a transaction, money buying votes, quid pro quos, backrooms, backroom deals. But money's real power is quieter and deeper. It decides which candidates get to run, which policies are thinkable, and whose voices get amplified or ignored. Money has rewritten the rules of self government slowly, invisibly, and almost entirely within the law, which is the real scandal, right? Always that which is legal. And because of Supreme Court decisions, Buckley v. Vallejo, Citizens United, he notes that the front doors to reforming the system are locked, and that we need to think about other ways of limiting the money in politics. So he discusses how money helps. He starts with campaign spending, and he notes the general ineffectiveness of what most campaigns spend their money on. As somebody who's managed political campaigns for almost 20 years now, I can say I'm in almost complete agreement with what he says. Television ads are highly ineffective. In the local races that I specialize in, money goes into direct mail. We'll talk about voter mobilization separately, field, in other words. But I do want to say, talking about general elections for the most part, right? There's no amount of money that Donald Trump or any of the super PACs that were supporting him could have spent to get me to vote for Donald Trump. And of course, tens of millions of Americans feel the same way. And it works, the inverse is true as well. No amount of money will convince tens of millions of other people to have voted for Kamala Harris. We're really talking about, at that level, we're talking about 150 voters, 160 million voters at the presidential level. We're really talking about 20 million people that you're trying to move. So that explains sort of the paradox of like these ads aren't really that helpful, but under the right circumstances, an ad like Trump's famous "they them" can, go, touch the right buttons and move just a few people in the middle from one side to the other, as we experienced in some of the swing states or during the presidential election. But so this money's not effective, and yet campaigns all feel like they have to raise all this money. I certainly, when I'm managing a campaign, I insist that my candidates do their call time so that we can be on TV if needed, on social media now, of course, which is really starting to replace TV, particularly like the state legislative level, which is where I do most of my work, and also direct mail. Um, so the general election. So the caveat here is that it's in the general election; these are ineffective. In primaries, where you often have a field of five, six, or more candidates, many of whom are relatively unknown, These things then become really important. And Boddicker mentions that, but he doesn't really give it the proper emphasis, I feel. But like the money, it's the early money in the campaign's first start that gives a candidate a heads up in the primary. And that's, for most state legislative or congressional districts, the primary is where it's at. We have very few contested general elections for these offices, which is because of gerrymandering, it's because of the first to the post way that we structure our elections to determine who wins. But candidates spend all this money. For the most part, it's to have an early advantage. That's why Emily's list was named Emily, right? Early money is like yeast, it raises the dough. But that money is absolutely critical. And he goes on to talk a little bit about voter mobilization. So if you do have a contested race, even for general election voters in particular, voter mobilization is an expensive project. Basically, trying to get occasional voters, less committed voters who would vote for your candidate if they voted, but don't particularly care about voting. You spend enough, a little bit. And in a general election, we're talking about 2%. But in a close race, the 2% is well worth the expenditures. But, to get back to the main theme, the primary is really the focus of fundraising and the need to be able to raise money early. It acts as a great filtering device, which is what how Adam Monica talks about it. So people who can announce their candidacy and then raise 50, 100, those are the people who are going to be seen in the media as serious candidates. Those are the ones who are going to be able to start getting their name out there in a way to be recognized. And those early advantages can compound over the course of the campaign, where candidates who don't have the ability to raise money are forced eventually to drop out. This is one of the reasons that, and Adam talks very eloquently about this, why we have so many lawyers. Now, lawyers are less than 1/2 of 1% of Americans, and yet they're almost 50% of elected leaders in legislative bodies. And a major, major reason for this is that lawyers are very good about supporting each other for election up front. And they have these very dense, tight, these very dense professional networks where, people, lawyers are well known to each other. They understand, because they're lawyers, they understand the importance of the legislative process and being involved in that. So they are very quick to give at substantial levels. So and that's why lawyers, even more than affluent people in general, are much more likely to be represented. The average congressperson is 12 times more likely than the average citizen to be in Congress, but a lawyer is 100 times, according to Adam Monica, 100 times more likely to be represented in Congress because they can raise this early money through their professional networks. And candidates without the early backing, they struggle to hire staff. They struggle to gain media attention, as I mentioned. So many voices are not even heard at all. All right. The next thing that he talks about that's really substantial is that fundraising becomes so important that it attracts certain personality type. Even people who are successfully elected to Congress, they have, as part of their job, the requirement of fundraising constantly. And they have, across from Capitol Hill, they have offices where congressmen go, and they sit there in little cubicles, sometimes up to 4 or 5 hours a day, cold calling strangers, asking for money. So that attracts, as he says, a certain personality type. Most politicians hate it. I can say that from many years of personal experience. But the people who love it, it's a huge advantage for them. And that's why, that's why Rahm Emanuel keeps cropping up on a list of potential candidates for president, for instance. He is somebody who just loves fundraising aspect of the job because it gives him the opportunity to talk to the people he loves most. And that's the other thing. In addition to selecting from a personality type, you are always talking to people who can give you, $2,500, $5,000, or more at a shot. And those people, they have different concerns than working Americans, and their concerns get heard because they're always talking to congressmen who are begging them for money. Adam refers to some of the research that shows that in terms of which ideas become policies, it is always, always, always the beliefs and ideas of the ultra wealthy that become legislation. It is almost never the legislation that would truly benefit working families. There, when you get down into the committee hearings and the deal making in the cloakrooms of the Senate, for instance, those concerns just never break through because of the money. So, it has devastating consequences for the policies that get passed. The next thing that Adam Bonica talks about in this essay is the power of corporate lobbying. And again, that's less about the power of elections than it is just the everyday access that lobbyists have to our elected leaders and their ability to provide post political job opportunities for the elected leaders and their staff. So there's this permanent class of political elites who are indebted to, the big money, the corporate money, the billionaires. And they understand even when they're a lowly intern in a congressional office, like that's the path that they're aiming for. And that makes it, again, just impossible for the interests of working Americans to really come front and center. And then the last thing he discusses are, not just corporations, but the ultra wealthy and their singular impact. And we're talking about, he talks here about how Mark Cuban himself was able to put the kibosh on a proposal that Kamala Harris had for a minimum tax on unrealized gains, something that would only affect about 10,000 people. But Mark Cuban was one of those 10,000 people, and he threatened to withhold his support, both for the campaign and for super PACs supporting the campaign, if Kamala Harris promoted this idea. She had hinted that this was something she was looking at. Cuban said, no, this is unacceptable, and the idea disappeared. There's my wife, Ann. Welcome back. So, and the Republicans are even more indebted to the billionaire class than, and we see that with Elon Musk. Even though his tenure was brief, the simple fact is he dropped $250 million into the campaign on behalf of Donald Trump. And he was, without being vetted or voted on by the Senate, was given a quasi-official position where he was had the ability to access the personal records of every American, and B, had the authority to demand that federal workers justify their paycheck. And that didn't ultimately pan out. But the truth is, he had the infrastructure, the work emails of all of the federal employees to send out that email, and he had the support of the president in extracting, people's descriptions of how they were spending their time and why their jobs were worth it. So at this stage in our history, this is the level of corruption that we have. So, Adam is good about describing the crisis that all this political money has. But he's, like I said, he acknowledges that most of the straightforward proposals that would limit big money in politics have already been declared constitutional. So, wealthy candidates can spend unlimited sums on their own campaigns. Super PACs can raise, representing the interest of the billionaire class and large corporations, can spend unlimited sums of money promoting their ideas. And this, continually distorts our politics. He does try to end with a somewhat positive note, and the first thing he notes is that there is some evidence that public financing of campaigns works. He cites, the recent mayoral campaigns in Seattle and New York, where candidates meeting certain thresholds were able to qualify for public funds, which meant that they didn't have to prostrate themselves before big money donors, and they produced candidates who represented a more diverse set of life circumstances. Whether the election of Mandami is a great triumph for democracy, time will tell. But there was a mechanism in place where not just him, but other candidates who would not have access to enough money to run a credible campaign did have that access, thanks to public financing of campaigns. I have extensive experience with the city of Los Angeles's public campaign financing, and I think it is a great model. Basically, up to the amount changes by election, but up to a certain amount, $500 or $1,000, the city will match it. So you convince a donor to give, say, just even $100, right? The city will match that six times over, so it becomes $600. And with that, you can, if you collect enough $100 donations, $250 donations, be a credible candidate. Now, LA is an extremely expensive market to compete in. So, you have to raise a lot of money, but you can raise significant funds at the, say, $100 level, which is about the amount that most working families, if they were really invested in a campaign, would consider donating. Once you get to the $200, $500 level, you're talking about people who are either ideologically extremely committed or have some sort of professional interest. And then once you get to the higher amounts, obviously, we're talking about even more entrenched power interests. But the LA model does allow regular citizens to contribute in a way that becomes meaningful in how campaigns are run. So I would strongly encourage that. And I agree with Adam on that. I did have a couple of other points I wanted to sort of make based on what he wrote. One thing I would say, and again, this is something I've seen with my own eyes over many years, the big money is to take unpopular positions, right? So, the billionaires give money to protect the carried interest tax credit, or, other tax breaks that benefit themselves. That's, that's a woefully unpopular idea. Cutting Social Security. That idea keeps coming up because the Republican mega donors really are invested in that. That's a super unpopular idea, as is cutting healthcare spending. And we're seeing that play out right now. The big money is for unpopular positions. And conversely, we see that on, in Democratic politics, the school closings, for instance, wildly unpopular. Most cities kept the schools closed much longer than they would have if they were listening to regular voters. But the teachers union organizations I love, but they're extremely powerful because they give such great amounts of money and because they provide basically a volunteer army. But again, Democratic candidates take that support because the position is unpopular. Same with like charter schools in the African American community. There were the African American districts, charter schools, other school choice options are very popular. And in a party that is utterly dependent on the African American vote, those policy preferences almost never make it into policy. And because that hope that the policy preferences of African American families is diametrically opposed to the interests of the teachers' unions. For good or for bad, I can go either way on charter schools or other sort of choice measures. But I mean, just as the sheer raw politics of it. So, that's just the way that works. Corporate money should, and related to that, just as Adam talks about trying to limit corporate money, we should also try to limit the money of other interest groups, including, just for example, the teachers union. They give so much money that, again, it distorts actual governance. So, it's not just, Adam has this whole thing where, look, the Republicans take all these billionaire money, and Democrats should just say, we won't accept it. That won't hurt us that much, but it'll allow us to draw a clear contrast with the Republicans. That's true. We could do that. But we also have our own interest groups that fund and support our campaigns through volunteer efforts. And honest effort to rein in the power of special interest groups would need to accommodate that. And the third thing I would note is that campaigns should just be much shorter. These campaigns, even for a state rep seat, they start, well over a year before. So, we're looking at November 2026. Right now, I'm in Illinois, but campaigns had to be up and running no later than August of 2025, just in order to start circulating petitions. Campaigns, there's no reason whatsoever why state legislative campaigns, why municipal campaigns should be more than congressional campaigns, even. No reason why those campaigns should last more than a year. And I don't think campaigns should be allowed to set up a formal committee before, more than a year before to start raising money. And then so states would have to alter their campaign calendar so you wouldn't be able to have primaries in March, for instance, like in Illinois. They would move gradually into the summer or early fall. Like in New England, most of the primaries are in late August, early September. And that's about right. For a state legislative campaign, for a congressional race, that's perfect. You don't need candidates grinding it out for a year and a half. And again, that's a year and a half that they have to raise. That's, because they have to support staff for a longer time. They have a longer period for sending out mail and mass communication with the electorate. So shortening up the campaigns should be able to get some of the money out. And presidential campaigns could be 18 months or 2 years, but they don't need to be, that long. Most other countries in the world, their presidential prime minister campaigns, they last 3 months, and that's more than adequate to get reasonably good leadership. The other point of that is that, campaigns, if the person gets elected, these campaigns committees never close. And if we were to require that campaign committees only be open for the year before the campaign, plus some reasonable amount of time afterwards to make sure all the books balance and all the vendors get paid and all that stuff, maybe 15 months, 3 months on the back end, that would actually create a period of time, a year or so, where no money's being raised, where there's no fundraising activities that are possible, where our elected leaders could actually govern. So I think I've always felt that that was an important reform that people should consider. The next point I want to make is that the first to the post election structure, where the candidate with the most votes wins, regardless of how many votes they get, it exacerbates the significance of money. If we had, so I mean, because you have basically one deadline, it's, that's all or nothing. That, it really puts a premium on making sure that all the campaigns have the resources and are spending it towards that one day. Legislatures at the state level, at Congress, should be excuse me, multi-member districts with proportional representation. Those campaigns could be a lot cheaper. You would have to spend some money, but just here in Chicago, if instead of having 50 aldermanic districts, we had, 10, and each district had 5 candidates, and the sort of top 5 vote getters are elected regardless of affiliation or then that would all it would be much easier. A candidate could win with many fewer votes than the top candidate, but still represent a diverse constituency. And really, like if we had something like that in Chicago, we're a city that is roughly 20% Republican. If you look at Trump's vote totals, he roughly got about 20% throughout the city. Gubernatorial candidates that are more moderate can get, 25%. And yet, there's one Republican on the Chicago City Council. If we had a multi-member district that had proportional representation of any sort, the top 5 vote getters is simply the easiest of those, but any type of proportional representation, you would expect there to be 10 to 15 Republicans on the city council. And while I'm not a fan of Republican ideas, they represent real people, and those people deserve representation. And maybe you would get a couple of Greens or a Libertarian or whatever. If we're serious about actual diversity, that's an important reform. And you could, I would, it would diminish the importance of money. Adam talks about how staffers and politicians end their career time in government service and then become lobbyists. That is a revolving door. Over the course of a 40-year career, people can move in and out of government any number of times. And really, we should be much stricter about closing that revolving door. Much longer, sometimes there'll be a year cooling off period, but that doesn't mean anything, and so that's one thing we should consider. The next thing, we should actively recruit candidates from other professions, including blue collar and service professions. I mentioned earlier, based on Adam's research, that lawyers are massively overrepresented. There's no reason why small business owners or people who are successful as a good auto mechanic, like they have real experiences that would be helpful to have, or just anything. And I think, and again, I'll just talk about the Democratic Party on this case. But we should be recruiting candidates like that. We should be identifying potential talent early on, training them how to speak in public, how to craft a position, how to network, all the things that are so important in politics. But, there's been some minor interest in that, but not nearly enough. And I think that that's something that truly representing the interests of working class Americans, that's what we would do. In Democratic Party politics, we often take group interest positions or interest group positions as a representative of huge swaths of professions. And that's really not the case. And we saw that because Joe Biden was the most pro-union president in American history. Seriously, he gave them whatever they wanted. But that did not result in union votes because the union members were much more diverse than the union leadership who were making the asks of Biden in terms of policy and making the endorsements. So we must broaden that up. So those are just a few of the ideas that I had about this. But please, I'll put Adam's article in the notes to this. Please give it a listen. Money in politics, it is perhaps the most fundamental fight. We cannot have a thriving democracy if it's overrun by money.